Hi, I'm Patrick, and welcome back to Comparative Politics. That sounded weirdly upbeat. Well, we'll correct for that soon. Now, we today move confidently out of the first part of the course. In the first couple of very much introductory lectures, we kind of made you familiar or re-familiarized you with some of the vocabulary that we will use on comparative politics. So you've heard about some of the key concepts, about the why, about the how, of how to do this. And you've heard something about comparative research designs from Carlo Basta. And today we will start that second big chunk of the course where we will look at the first actual empirical phenomenon that we will analyze using the comparative method. So what we will do today is we will be looking at political regimes. So if you had a glance at the course handbook, you will see that the first part of the course is all about comparing different types of regimes. We can only compare these usefully if we all use the same language and if we know what we're doing, essentially, which is what the whole course is about. So what this introductory lecture to that part is designed to do is we will look at how do we distinguish between different regime types, how do we come up with our categories, and what do those mean for further analysis. So today it's all about how do we actually distinguish between different regimes. So, as a very small recap, don't worry, this is going to go very fast. Let's remember that the important parts when we implement a comparative research design is that we identify a clear question. We work out why this is an interesting question. Why do we care, right? Why is this something that we should spend time thinking about? What is the outcome that we're specifically interested in and how we will measure or classify that outcome? And what are the explanations that with which we could end up at that specific outcome, and how do we identify or measure those? And how are those sides of the equation really linked? Why is the one factor linked to the other? Why are, for example, female prime ministers better at dealing with the COVID crisis? Or at least that's what some people have hypothesized. How are those two things linked? And then what is our unit of analysis? Are we looking at countries? Are we looking at municipalities, at continents, or whatever? So all of these things we need to have in mind as we develop our research design. And you've heard this from me and presumably also from Carlo, is that one of the main questions that we always have to answer early on in the process is how many cases we need. Single case studies can be okay. If you're only doing descriptively, then it's no bueno. What you do have to use single case studies for is generate hypotheses. You can confirm or reject theories or examine specific deviant cases. And one of the examples that we gave was Leiphardt's Politics of Accommodation, because the Netherlands was so weird about having a very divided society, but then a political style that was very much geared towards cooperation. You can do small n comparisons where you basically just pick as many cases as necessary, only the cases that you're really interested in. Michael Keating's Nations Against the State was one such example. And the idea was that in this particular case, between Quebec, Catalonia, and Scotland, you would identify certain commonalities. What do those cases have in common and how are they different? In order to then explain why we arrive at a certain outcome. So for example, why are these regions particularly well developed when it comes to their own nationalism and nationalist movements? And then lastly, we can have large n comparisons, and the example I gave was the World Values Survey that you see down there. I gave you a chart, by the way, that was a couple of years out of date. They have a current one there, so if you want to Google World Values Survey, if you want to look at some more of these interesting maps of the world and maps of the world's values, then make sure you check out that website. And that approach is very much one of looking at as many cases as possible rather than as many cases as necessary. And this is mainly done in a quantitative or statistical way because, we have too many cases to really care in detail about each individual one. And we can then investigate a number of variables that might all have to do with the outcome we're trying to explain. So that's just a very short recap. That's roughly how comparative politics works, and that's the things we have to keep in mind as we do comparative politics. So let's dive into the first thing, the first empirical phenomenon, the first item that varies across the world that we're trying to explain. So in our case, that is political regimes. We know that the whole world isn't the same. We know that states are different. States are differently set up. States perform different numbers and types of people are involved in decision making in different states. So we know there's variation. But let's think about this for a second so that we get our terminology exactly right. What do we mean when we say political regime? In normal, everyday use, a regime probably has like a negative connotation, like the Smith regime is like, the evil overlord or the dictator of some place. In political science and in comparative politics specifically, regime is completely neutral. All that a regime means is a certain system of rule. So it's a collection of things that together define how a political system, how a system of rule works. Normally, two things we want to be on the lookout for here is the political regime is the political and governance structures through which rule is exercised. So which institutions are there that are actually exercising the political rule. And normally the unit of analysis is the sovereign state. So we wouldn't really call it, the Scotland, we wouldn't call it a regime necessarily, or, one of the German Länder, the federal states, we also wouldn't call that a regime. A regime tends to be kind of the topmost political entity in a given territory. It's important to recognize, this goes actually for all of the next kind of slides and this whole discussion about regime types, is that there's obviously ideal types and there's obviously real world cases. Most countries don't fall squarely into specific categories. The categories to distinguish different regimes from each other aren't necessarily designed to capture any one individual case. They're supposed to be general categories. So an ideal type would describe a country that doesn't necessarily exist in reality. So let's always remember that that is a job of a categorization though. So it's okay if you have an ideal type and then the case that you're using doesn't entirely fall within the purview of that specific ideal type. Now, what are some of the dimensions of regimes that vary? So how can we distinguish systems of rule from each other? How do we distinguish between how different states' political systems are set up? So the first question we could ask is, who has access to political power and how is access to political power restricted? So, for example, can everyone in the country potentially get into a leadership role? Are, for example, women excluded? Are minorities excluded? Do the poor tend to be excluded, whether implicitly or explicitly? Rarely is this explicit, but again, we know, of course, systems of rule where only, say, property holders were able to vote and therefore access political power. So it's not, that's not out of the question. We should then ask, so access to political power is the first possible variable we can look at in distinguishing regimes. So some regimes, lots of people will have access to power. Some regimes, very few people will have access to power. Then what are the interactions, checks, and balances between institutions in that central power structure? Normally, we tend to distinguish executive from legislative from judicial. Almost all states in the world have these institutions, but in some states, these are more independent of each other and they act as true checks and balances. In other countries, that's not quite so clear. You could have, for example, an absolute monarchy where the monarch is both the head executive, so they decide what happens politically. They're also the legislature, so they sign off on laws and regulations. They might even be the head judge, so they might be the topmost judicial power in the country. So how do political regimes vary in this particular way? So how are the interactions between different parts of the political system set up? The third possible distinguishing factor between regimes is how are the relations between the central power structure and wider society. Is this largely a consensual process, or is this a process, for example, where the central power structure can demand certain things to happen and wider society has to fall in line? And then lastly, what are the characteristics of the ruler? So is this an elected person, for example, or is this a hereditary ruler, or however else this is set up? So with these 4 axes, we already get quite a bit of leverage out of distinguishing political regimes. If you think of any 2 countries that you could think of off the top of your head, and you go through these points, you will probably have a pretty good idea where they vary in their regime type after you've gone through these. But what's important to remember is this is not the only way to distinguish regimes, and I will talk about this in a few slides. This idea of distinguishing political regimes by some characteristics, of course, is quite old. That is not a new invention, distinguishing states by their systems of rule. And the comparison of what was then called constitutions, so the way that political regimes are set up, actually goes way, way back. We can take this all the way back to ancient Greece. We have Plato, for example, and his student Aristotle, who were both political theorists, but were also arguably some of the first comparative political scientists, because they took a systematic look around, admittedly, their corner of the world, and they looked at the city-states, empires, kingdoms, fiefdoms, whatever there was around the time, and they tried to develop a typology, a categorization of which regimes could be systematically distinguished from which others. By the way, little mnemonic device, little consumer advice here from me. If you can never remember, there was Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. If you can never remember who taught whom there, just remember that all the ancient Greeks went to the spa all the time. Spa is S-P-A, so Socrates taught Plato, taught Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, spa, that's your mnemonic device. So, one example of this at work was Aristotle, who wrote a book called Politics. I mean, talk about quite the title. And in book 4, for example, he distinguishes different types of constitutions. He classifies them, and he says, well, there could be rule by one, there could be rule by a few, and there could be the rule by many. And then for each of these possible types, he then says, well, there's a good way of doing that, and there's a bad way of doing that. As an example, if you have a rule of one, you can have a good rule of one, that's a monarchy, with a essentially benevolent monarch that probably listens to at least some of its citizens and takes their preferences into account. If you have a bad rule of one, you have a tyranny, where someone is just at the top and they just do whatever they want without really considering their underlings' preferences or wishes. The rule by few is possibly, together with the rule by one, at that time the most popular system of rule. And this could either be an aristocracy, so where a specific class of people tends to end up in leadership positions, such as was the case in ancient Greece oftentimes, or you could have a bad version of this where you have an oligarchy where it's a different group of people that is potentially not quite as open and not quite as accessible to others that is leading the country. Now, hilariously, he says, well, the rule by many, so what we maybe today would call a democracy, actually, he says, I can only find bad examples of this. There is no good way to arrange the rule of many. He doesn't even come up with a proper word for it. He just says that's generally a bad idea and leads to bad outcomes. So he didn't really believe, much like many other ancient philosophers, in democracy as we today know it. So one thing that's important, of course, is that the definitions of these categories and classifications do change over time. We can't just use, the definition and classifications of democracy from ancient Greece to describe the world as it is today. Now, democracy, let's look at our first possible system of rule, at our first possible regime. Democracy, generally defined, and we'll define this more closely on the next slide, we can use the shorthand that this is the rule by the people. We also call this popular sovereignty. So the topmost sovereign of that political entity that we're describing is the citizens themselves. There is no one on top of this that has legitimate authority forever to make rules for everyone. Now, mind you, of course, and I'm going like a bullet point ahead here, we're not necessarily saying that the people have to rule every minute of every day. We all live in representative democracies. Very few systems in the world are direct democracies, where the citizens are asked for every political decision what their will is. Normally we say it's enough if every couple of years we elect people that then essentially translate our will into political decision making. But so it's ruled by the people, obviously, and Przeworski has this wonderful definition that a democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. Now, why that's a bit of a funny definition, of course, is that losing elections arguably is a more democratic feature than winning elections. Because after all, you can win elections by any number of in any number of ways. You can even try to win elections, like you see in the picture here, by trying to assert that the whole election was stolen from you. Whether that works or not is a different question. So the ability for someone to actually lose an election if they've previously held power is quite a fundamental aspect of democracy. Now you might ask, though, of course, and here the contestation comes in, who are the people? Who should be the people that rule here? Who should be the people that are involved in electing representatives or making the rules? Now, this doesn't just relate to, way back, for example, when women weren't allowed to vote, or in the US, when the black population wasn't allowed to vote in the same way as the white population. This, in a sense, still continues today. For example, I am not allowed, because I'm an EU citizen, to vote in national elections in the UK. I can vote in some local elections and I can vote in EU elections, RIP, but I can't vote in national elections. So who are the people? After all, I could argue, I live here, I pay taxes, I teach you guys, I work, so why wouldn't I be involved in this? So how do we define the people that then elect their own sovereigns? And the second thing is, is it, for example, a better or worse democracy if it's indirect compared when it's direct? So we're already arriving at some points where we are discussing nuances of the term. Essentially, what democracies thus have to contend with is how do the people's preferences get channeled into a system of rule? So calling it rule by the people is only one step, unless you're willing to install a terminal at everyone's house where every day you ask them, these are the political decisions of the day, please click yes or no. So if you don't want to do that, if there has to be some way of translating this into a representative system, then you have to come up with a good way of doing that. So, democracy, generally speaking, rule by the people. Let's think about a couple of definitions. Obviously, the super basic definition could just be, whoever's in power got there because they were elected, rather than say they were born as the son or daughter of the previous ruler. That's probably a little bit too simple, though, because it creates too many what we call edge cases. So if the people in power are elected, what happens, for example, in a state where you only have one party and you can really not vote for anyone but the main candidate? That would still fit our definition of, the people in power are elected, but is that a meaningful election, for example? So that definition probably doesn't get us very far. Now let's look at two definitions that are a little bit more elaborate here. We have one that's fairly sparse by Alvarez, Chaibu, Blimongi, and Przeworski from 1996. They essentially make 4 rules. The first rule is the chief executive has to be elected. So you have to have a president, a prime minister, or whatever kind of head figure that has to be elected by the populace. Rule number 2, the legislature has to be elected too. So you can't have either of those two be unelected. Rule number 3 is there has to be more than one party. You can't have a proper functioning democracy when you only have one party, whether that's effectively one party or explicitly one party. So, there are other parties, for example, that you could technically vote for, both in, East Germany while it was around. There's other parties in China that you can vote for, but functionally, as far as it matters, there's really only one party you can vote for. And then rule number 4 is an interesting one because it relates to something I've said on the previous slides, is have incumbents at least once lost an election before, which is a bit of a funny rule, right? Because you could think of a number of countries that would fit all these 3 rules. Like you could think of a country where everyone that's in power is elected, there is more than one party, but for some reason, That one party hasn't been in power for 50 years, and they've always won the elections with 88% of the vote. Would we quite call this a functioning democracy, or maybe we wouldn't? Now, I'm going to leave that judgment up to you. And there's, of course, a couple of ideas by people. And I don't know why my dog is screaming, but let me just take care of that really quick. Okay, we had a little word there. All good. Now, a thicker definition of what a democracy means comes from Dahl 1973, and we'll see in a second why I would call it a thicker definition. So the first bullet point here is not that dissimilar from the other side. So elected officials should be chosen in frequent, fair, and free elections. So this, presumably with Dahl, goes both for the chief executive and the legislature. There has to be a general right to vote, and there has to be a right to compete for public office. You could think of a system, for example, where everyone's allowed to vote, but only specific people are allowed to run for office, which of course would be almost quite as unfair as, those people not being allowed to vote, or the majority of people not being allowed to vote. There has to be a right of leaders to compete for votes. We see all around the world, oftentimes opposition leaders, for example, in hotly contested elections, are sometimes prohibited from appearing. There might even be imprisoned, or otherwise their ability to campaign might be impaired, and that can't be the case for a well-functioning democracy. And generally speaking, says Dahl, the institutions for making policies depend on votes and other expressions of preference. So you can't have someone involved in the actual decision-making procedure that is not in some way legitimized by voting and elections. And then Dahl adds two things that, for example, play no great role in the sparse definition by Alvarez and others on the other side, and that is that there should be the freedom to form and join organizations. Those could be parties, for example, arguably the most important type of organization in a democracy, but also other forms of civil society. And there has to be a freedom of expression. Now you could think for yourself, do you think freedom of expression is completely necessary for a democracy? We probably would intuitively all say yes, but you can maybe think for yourself a little bit of why that's important. Why is it important for a democracy that we add that point, and that it's not enough that we just have these four rules on the other side? So pick a side maybe for yourself and see if you like the sparse definition better than the thick definition, maybe why that is the case. So now that's the one side of the spectrum, democracies. Let's look at the other side of the spectrum. Let's look at authoritarian regimes. Now, why are we calling this the other side of the spectrum? Well, oftentimes authoritarian regimes are called autocracies. That comes from the Greek auto, self, and kratos, meaning power and strength. Yeah, just like Kratos in the God of War games. I didn't know that, now you do. And the difference from an autocracy to a democracy is that rules in an autocracy are generally made without reference to popular preferences or to popular consent. So rules and regulations are implemented and arrived at without asking those that are affected by them whether or not they like these, which is of course how it works in a democracy. If you don't like a specific rule or law, you could vote out the people that have created it, and you can vote in people that will do away with that rule. It is essentially an absolutist style of rule, so that means that obedience to authority is worth more than personal freedoms. Now you could think of some situations where that's maybe seems merited to people. In times of great uncertainty, for example, you might be more worried that someone is securely in charge and, makes sure the country is safe rather than everyone being free and able to self-express. But generally speaking, that's how these systems work. The category of autocracy sometimes is a bit of a residual category. So the sparsest definition of an autocracy is basically just everything that's not a democracy. So everything that doesn't fit into these categories, any country, for example, that on the left here doesn't follow these four rules, we wouldn't call a democracy, we would call it autocracy. Now, forms of authoritarian rule can take quite a few different shapes. So we have things like traditional authoritarianism. So an authoritarianism that is based essentially on traditional societal values, such as in Saudi Arabia. That doesn't, by the way, mean that all societies that are traditional maybe have this form of rule, but in Saudi Arabia it's the case. You can have communist authoritarianism in places like China today or the Soviet Union back during the Cold War. You can have fascist regimes, such as in Nazi Germany, that are also built as autocracies, where you have one person at the top. And there's this idea that you have this total mobilization of a state in following this one leader. And then you can have military rule. A lovely word that I learned just yesterday was kakistocracy. So because the military wears khakis, like that's where it's a kakistocracy. That is the case today in Egypt and in Sudan. Today the leader of Egypt, of course, is the former defense minister that staged somewhat of a coup, and they got re-elected under less than democratic circumstances. Sudan, and then of course we have tons of examples from other world regions. Latin America in the 70s had a whole epidemic of these. So, I wanted to say, yes, this is also, if you have a monarchy, at least an absolute monarchy, this is also, of course, a type of autocracy. I just now realized that having these pictures together is questionable. So let's just ignore that for the moment. Okay, now there could be things in the middle. If we have democracies on the one side of the spectrum and autocracies on the other side of the spectrum, isn't there sort of a gray area in the middle? Aren't there countries that don't quite fall squarely into either of these two categories? And the answer to that would be yes, there is. And we call these anocracies. So those are neither democracies nor autocracies, but they are, as Polity4 calls this, a middling category rather than a distinct form of governance. Countries whose government are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic, but rather combine an often incoherent mix of both traits and practices. While I'm bringing up Polity4, you will hear Polity4 a lot, especially in the next lectures by Sarah Liu. Polity4 is a big research project that has as a goal classifying all the regimes in the world, all the way back starting in 1815, I believe, in terms of where they are on the spectrum between democracy and autocracy. And what they essentially say is, rarely does a state choose to just be an anocracy. So that's not really necessarily a choice on the part of the leaders. It just happens when you're not quite squarely in either of the two sides of the spectrum. So it's a form of hybrid regime, and normally what we do is we also distinguish still between closed anocracies and open anocracies. Closed anocracies are just sort of hybrid regimes that are closer to the autocracy end of the spectrum, and open anocracies are the ones that are closer to the democratic side of the spectrum. So another way to think about this a little bit is this tends to be authoritarianism without that strong central authority. So in other words, those are states that might have been authoritarian before, but that aren't quite there anymore. It's a little bit like Mussolini being in charge of a daycare. So he might still have the same traits as a leader, he might still want the same things, but the system around him isn't accommodating to him in terms of exerting that authority. So it's often difficult in anocracies to maintain central control because institutions might be open, but they're also ineffective. And oftentimes these types of hybrid regimes are linked to instability and conflict. Most of the time, this will also be because they are in transition. Anocracy tends to be a category where you're not in forever necessarily, but you either just moved off one end of the spectrum, either in a good or a bad sense, or you're on the way to the other side of the spectrum. And anything that moves states between categories tends to be a process of at least temporary instability and possibly also conflict. We'll come back to that map in a slide or two. There is many different ways, of course, to classify regimes. So those 4 categories that I told you a couple of slides ago, or the 2 definitions by Dahl or by Alvarez and others are only one way to distinguish between regimes. I'm just going to show you really quick one of the other ways, for example, to classify regimes. This is from Wiggle in 2008. He says that democracy has 2 distinct elements to it. Democracy, on the one hand, is electoralism. So it is a system where representation is achieved, where those that are subject to rules elect those that make those rules. And on the other hand, there's an element of constitutionalism. So there has to be a rule of law, that everyone's accountable to the law, that no one's above the law, and that includes the people in power. So he makes the simple formula that democracy is popular government and limited government. If you don't have either of those two, you fall out of the full category of a democratic regime. And you can see in the bottom right here, in the bottom left, I just get my pointer. This is, for example, this little graph that he makes here. So if you have a system that scores low on electoralism, so there's not much representation and not much of a rule of law, you end up in authoritarian regimes. If both are there, you end up in democratic regimes. But then he says, of course, there's also two other combinations of these factors. There could be electoral autocratic regimes. So, for example, an essentially autocratic ruler that gets reaffirmed in their role by elections, whether or not those elections are so in other words, there are elections, but the ruler is then not necessarily bound by the rule of law. Or you can have something that he calls constitutional oligarchic regimes, where you have a really strong rule of law, so with lots of laws, norms, regulations, and limits, but elections don't play a terribly large role here. So in that sense, a closed type of regime. And then you can also use the same kind of scale to even distinguish democracies from each other. Now, I'm not going to talk about this at any great length because Carlo Basta is going to have a whole lecture on this. But again, we can distinguish, how important is the electoralism in a democracy? Is this effective or is this limited? And the same goes for the rule of law. Is this limited or is this an effective execution of the rule of law here? And again, you can make these neat little graphs that showcase the differences between these systems. So there's several ways to classify regimes, of course, and we can only cover a few of them. But we'll encounter more of them during the course of the lecture. Now, let's look at some trends over time, because, of course, this is the interesting part now. We've outlined some definitions. We've outlined some criteria of which states we sort into which categories. So let's see how this has developed over time, so both chronologically and also geographically. Let's take this by world region because this is interesting. All of this data, again, comes from the Polity4 project, where they try to classify every single country in every single year in terms of where is it between democracy, a full democracy, and a full autocracy. You can see here the bottom end is this scale is the number of countries here. And you can see all the states that are classified as autocracies are in red, all the democracies are in blue, and then the anocracies, the ones that are sort of in the middle, are in black. And we can see that in South America, for example, in the past 70 plus years, we've seen a steady rise of democratic regimes. We did have a bit of a hiccup here in the 60s and 70s, where we had a sudden re-emergence of especially military rule. But at least the encouraging thing is that the middling category has essentially gone away, and so have the autocratic regimes. And at least according to the Polity4 categorization, we have a continent that is very, very largely democratic here in terms of its regimes. If you look at Europe, no very great surprises here. Of course, we have the Cold War, where we still had a significant number of autocracies in Europe. And then after 1990, when the Soviet Union fell and the Warsaw Pact fell, and the whole Eastern Bloc, we have a sudden rise in the number of democracies to the point where we have almost no autocracies or hybrid regimes left in Europe. This is, of course, Europe, how Polity4 defines it, not necessarily the European Union, because you couldn't be a European Union member if you were an autocracy. Now, let's keep going with another world region here that we could find interesting. That is Asia. Asia has a bit of a different picture here. You can already tell from the other world regions, in that for the majority of the 20th century, this was a region that was dominated by autocratic regimes. Doesn't mean that was all dictatorships, of course. Autocratic regimes can take a multitude of different shapes, but we can see that autocracies were clearly on the top, and it's really only been since the 90s that democracies have increased in number. But we also have a very big number of hybrid regimes, so regimes that might be on the way from one end of the spectrum to the other, or regimes that, for example, are called democratic but are only democratic on paper rather than functionally in reality. And then lastly, let's take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, where we have an interesting graph here. You see a huge number of autocracies. Of course, before the 1960s, there were very few independent states in Africa. Most of these were still colonies, so therefore that scale is all the way at the bottom. Once these became independent states, most of them were autocracies, at least for a large part of the 20th century. And again, it's only been the democratic wave of the late 20th century, since the 1990s, that has seen the number of autocracies sharply fall off. I mean, this is arguably the biggest drop in the number of autocracies that we see in any world region. We can see that democracy is on the rise, but really what's the most common system in sub-Saharan Africa are these hybrid regimes. So things, for example, that want to be democracies but aren't quite yet there, aren't functioning democracies as they are in maybe some other world regions. Just to show this in a slightly different way, if you graph this from 1816 to 2015, you can see that countries tend to rarely stay in one category forever. Shout out to Switzerland here, that's been at the top forever. But other countries can see quite a bit of movement. Maybe I can illustrate this a little bit by showing you this as an animated graph. So if you look at this graph, we will start in 1816. Countries will enter the graph as they become independent states. So not all of the countries I've selected here were independent back then. We can see that most of these states that I've selected weren't independent yet. Switzerland is coming in, and the UK as fairly democratic states, Canada, Nicaragua, and Romania as less democratic ones. We then have a wave of countries that all become independent after the end of the Second World War. But you can also see that there's a lot of movement between the categories, especially in the countries that weren't yet established democracies by the beginning of our little timeline here, and that lots of countries, including South Korea, Nigeria, and so on, have seen vast jumps up and down the scale. So let's go back to our little slide here. So the idea is that we compare things over time. And then let's have another look at these global trends over time. The global trends that we see here are that, generally speaking, democracies have been on the rise all the way since almost we've started categorizing systems as a whole. This was not necessarily a linear trend, so you do see certain times when there was a setback in terms of democracy. You can see, for example, here the wave of autocratic regimes and military leadership and fascist regimes in the 1930s and 1940s led to this setback here. We then had most of the world being autocratic systems all the way till the 1990s, and ever since then we see a sharp rise in the number of democratic systems over time and a drop off in the autocracies. Geographically speaking, that is where we are today. So this is a snapshot. I believe this is 2018 data. And here you also see a little bit more about the idea of closed anocracies versus open anocracies. So you see in dark red, states that are classified as full autocracies. So states that don't really have functioning democratic elements to them as we know them from our definitions. You see that there is certain differences, even in places like Europe, where you might have expected everything to be colored in one color. Not every state in Europe is the same on this particular scale here. And you see maybe some countries that you might have not expected, countries like Pakistan or Mongolia score very high on these democracy scales. And you see that a large part of the world, including Asia and large parts of Africa, are in this category of anocracies. So either closed anocracies that are closer to autocracies or open anocracies that are closer to democracies. So that's roughly how the world looks at the moment. And you see there's quite a bit of geographic variation. If we look at the number of people that live under specific political regimes, we have some encouraging news for you. If we start counting in 1800, we see that most of the world back in the day lived either in autocracies, so those might have been absolute monarchies, or they lived in colonies where they could have no participation in the decision-making at all. And nowadays we have very comfortably reached a level where the majority of the world does live in democracies. Shout out to India, of course, that contributes like 1.1 billion people to this graph. But of course, there's many other states that also are democratic. We see maybe that there's a bit of a plateauing. Like if you look at the size, the thickness of this autocracy shaded area here, you see that hasn't really necessarily grown smaller over time. And there's some discussion in the literature over what's happening at the moment, if we've seen a plateauing of democracy. So let's describe these trends over time a little bit in a little more detail. And then we're already coming towards the tail end of the lecture here. So there's a whole literature, for example, that examined this seemingly crucial point in 1990. You've seen, if we looked at the graphs across all kinds of world regions, that in the 1990s there seemed to be a new third wave of democratization. So something happened around the world that enabled lots of systems to become more democratic. And this was both the case in Latin America, in Southern Europe, in former communist countries of the Eastern Bloc, and even in Asia. And of course, Africa, not to forget this here. So the third wave of democratization really encompassed almost the entire world. But we've seen very mixed successes here. So the democracy's third wave isn't a complete turnaround of all the trends that we've seen before. We have some cases such as Chile, Spain, Portugal, or Eastern and Central Europe that have been quite successful at democratizing. We have some countries that have really only come part way, Colombia, for example, Ukraine, or Moldova. You've seen some states that, on the other hand, have actually slipped backwards, that have de-democratized, arguably, and de-democratized their political system and their political process, such as Russia or Kyrgyzstan. And we have a number of countries that just seemingly have been spared by this third wave of democracy. Belarus, of course, that you see here on the bottom right, is still a country that's essentially a one-person autocratic rule, and a couple of the other states of the former Commonwealth of Independent States, so the former Soviet Union, fall into this same category. So while there was a general wave of democratization around the world, that wave hasn't taken hold in all the places in the same way. And we mustn't forget that there's a counter trend, seemingly, to this wave of democratization, in that we see that in established democracies, participation actually is declining. So are we maybe seeing a sliding back on some of the progress we've made in terms of democratizing countries and keeping democracies stable, participatory, and accountable? So if you look at the world on average, you see here, if we start in the 1950s and we draw this all the way until today, I think the end point here is 2015, you can see that the voter turnout, so the percentage of people that turn out for their elections, has pretty much gone down in a uniform fashion over the past 60 years or so. Now you might say, okay, this has dropped from 78% to 68%. Is a 10% decline really that worrying? Maybe not, right? And we do see some countries where it's actually gone up very slightly. If you see Asia here, Asia starts here in the low 60s and it ends up here in the high 60s on the other side. But globally speaking, it seems participation in democracies is going down. And you can also see this if you chart on the right-hand side here, the difference in the voter turnout between the first election after introducing democracy in this variety of Eastern European countries and the current election. And you see that in almost all countries where this chart covers, the most recent elections have seen vastly fewer people turn out to actually participate in the democracy than the first elections. And that is, of course, a bit of a worrying trend because, you can have a democracy if you can keep it, is one of those things that is, I think it was an American founding father that said that. Or you can have a republic if you can keep it. So democracy, of course, has to be sustained, and that's something we'll talk about in those lectures. So declining participation in terms of voter turnout, so fewer people are willing to actually turn up and vote, and a lot of fewer people are actually willing to also organize themselves and participate in parties. You see on the left-hand side that the share of party members as a percentage of the electorate has gone down over the years pretty much uniformly. There was one blip in labor here, but it's gone down already again. So you see that fewer and fewer people join parties, which of course is an important form of political participation. And you see that this is a trend that's not just the case in the UK, but it's also the trend across a vast number of countries in Europe, where you see that the change in ratio of party membership to electorate, so if this is negative, that means that there's fewer and fewer people that are party members as a percentage of the electorate. In all of these countries, basically with the exception of France, Spain, Italy, and Estonia, these numbers have gone down over the past decade plus or so. So a rise in democratization in some countries, but also a decline in participation in established democracies. And of course, nowadays we face the question whether the established democracies are in fact getting hollowed out. Is there a real risk that countries that have comfortably for many decades been in the category of democracies, that their institutions get hollowed out and they might slip away from the kind of pure democratic systems that we tend to extol the virtues of? So Peter Meyer has written a lot about this. His last book was Ruling the Void in 2013. And what he says is that many of the policies that have been adopted in established democracies over the past decades have hollowed out the necessary institutions. So they have led to fewer people being members of political parties, fewer people being invested in civil society, fewer people turning up to vote, and so on. So a decline in the participation. And then on the other hand, a number of political shocks in advanced democracies that have all made us kind of scratch our heads and reconsider, what are actually the preferences of the majority of the people. So Trump is one of the examples here. Brexit is another, or, the rise of populist movements such as Bolsonaro in Brazil is another. So we've seen a rise of political parties and political leaders that have made their living on hollowing out democracy. In this sense, this really refers to the idea that you get someone in power through the democratic process that then doesn't actually value that democratic process that has brought them there. I mean, Trump essentially is just refusing to lose an election, like a kid not putting on its shoes when you want to go outside, and is attempting essentially to stay in power by that measure. So that is a hollowing out of institutions and of norms. All the people that have gone through the process should respect the process enough that even in cases where the process generates negative outcomes for yourself, you should still respect it. Because otherwise, of course, what good are political norms and political institutions if it's all just due to whether you like it or not? And of course, then we have at some point a kind of a confluence of the two things. So we have a resurgence of populism and we have increasing political shocks. We're currently living through the next political shock in the pandemic and the way that countries are struggling to adjust here. And the big question is now, is this really just, a co-occurrence of things at the same time, or might we actually be on pace for a re-autocratization of a number of established democracies in the world? And we'll discuss this at greater length in both the tutorial and maybe also in the live stream. So how sure are we that that graph that I showed you earlier with that nice line of democracies going up there is going to stay that way, or are we going to see at some point a breaking down, a slipping back of democracies? Now, a quick summary. So we have learned that there's a number of different ways to conceptualize and categorize and measure political regimes between democracy and authoritarianism, and that there's a number of different classifications and definitions we could use. So these are contested. There's not one true, accepted by all people definition of democracy, for example, or of autocracy. And about how to measure these things, how to place countries on a spectrum, that will be what the next two lectures with Dr. Sarah Liu are going to be about. We also have seen that over time, at least, we've seen a rapid growth of democracy as the dominant regime type. More and more states in the world are democratic in some sense, but that this trend might have slowed down, or we might even see a reversal of this, where some countries might fall out of that category, where previously it was a pretty safe bet that once you had reached that level, you would probably stay in that level, at least for a significant period of time. One thing that we have to remember is that all the nice graphs and pictures that I showed you, of course, they're essentially just descriptive. So they're just painting a picture of what is happening. I haven't yet painted a picture of why that is happening. So why are countries moving between categories? Why are countries ending up as autocracies or democracies? And how can countries move between these categories either voluntarily or involuntarily? Voluntarily through changes like democratization, involuntarily through things like revolutions and coups, for example. And that is what the next lectures with Dr. Carlo Basta are going to be about. That's it for me from categorizations. I hope you learned a tiny bit about the different classifications of political regimes, and I will see you in the next lecture in a few weeks. See you then.